The title and main thesis of this video is something that decades ago seemed so obvious to me that it felt beyond debate, not even approaching controversial at all, and in fact, it felt like something so self-evident that it shouldn't even have to be a conversation. Namely, that all tabletop role-playing games are narrative first. Well, things have changed since then. I'm thinking of the early 80s here, when D&D had its first big mainstream crossover success. This is the age of the red and blue boxes, AD&D, and the D&D Major Network cartoon series. Now, granted, the first major RPG, Dungeons & Dragons, had its roots in chainmail, which was a medieval miniatures wargame. People will often point this out whenever a conversation about the goals of roleplay come up, and it's true that D&D especially still feels a lot like a tactical miniatures game, more so than a modern TTRPG as we've come to know them. But this is role-playing in its infancy. What it quickly grew into, and continued to be for a long time, was a solidly role-play-focused game. That's why the genre was named for this quality, and not called a tactical leveling miniatures game or something like that. Then the first sophisticated graphical computer RPGs started to emerge. Some of the earliest examples, in fact, are D&D licensed games, such as the hugely important Pool of Radiance game that came out in 1988. Per necessity, these games were less about the player making character choices and directing the flow of the story, and a whole lot more about combat, puzzle solving, and what would come to be other staples of computer gameplay. Over time, CRPGs developed into a huge segment in digital games, influenced massively by D&D, but developing into their own thing, their own genre unto itself, both in terms of market share, but also the unique style of play and experience they provided. And increasingly, these games, along with massively successful MMORPGs, became many gamers' first experience with any kind of role-playing game at all. In other words, you had new TTRPG players showing up with a strong mental model already formed around how CRPGs work. Even later, in the late 90s, when Usenet was still a thing, indie designer Ron Edwards was evolving something that would come to be called GNS theory, which stands for what he considered to be the three goals of RPGs, namely gamism, simulationism, and narrativism. For a time, this concept dominated player discussions about various roleplay systems and their rules mechanics and what they tended to emphasize. The theory is that different players have different goals, and also that different systems emphasize these distinct aspects to different degrees. In other words, somebody who's big on traditional roleplay and having character choices drive the unfolding of the story would be classified as a narrativist in this paradigm, something I'd point out you can't do nearly as much with even the most current CRPGs. Even Baldur's Gate 3, a game that has many different outcomes and outworkings based on a player's choices, still has to give you a predetermined limited list of those choices with predetermined limited outcomes. And that's not meant as a dig, by the way. I enjoy Baldur's Gate 3, and I think it's a top-tier CRPG. A gamist, though, has winning as a main goal. Your classic metagamer and your min-maxer would be gamists, according to the GNS way of looking at things. And finally, simulationism is a concern with internal consistency and recreating a certain kind of reality, even if it's different from ours. So, for example, if you're playing Toon, which is a classic RPG about cartoon characters existing within a cartoon story, you aren't really too concerned with how physics work in the real world in most cases. Still, players who in other games do desire things to be more realistic would be considered simulationists here. More significantly, certain games were identified by these categories. This or that is a gamist RPG, they'd say, or this one or that one was a simulationist RPG. Now, you don't hear this idea of GNS models much anymore, and even Edwards himself has said that these ideas have outlived their usefulness. But I think that this idea so dominated fan thought for so long that it's hard for many people to escape how it's changed the way they think about these games. Personally, I never really could buy into the whole GNS thing. And I've also often struggled with players coming from CRPGs and other video games that have roleplay elements, and they expect a tabletop role-playing game to feel or play out on the table in very similar ways. And sometimes it felt to me that CRPGs really cemented the whole smash and grab mentality, with players unconcerned with the story but bent on getting gold and leveling up as rapidly as they could. Of course, not everyone who came from CRPGs to TTRPGs had these tendencies, perhaps not even a big majority of them, but it was enough to notice. And thinking about all these things has brought me back to the conclusion that, as a youngster in the early 80s, I already held. That these games are all about the narrative, and are all intended to be narrative first, and almost always have been, at least from about the early 80s onward. Think about this. If you removed every aspect of narrative from a game of, say, D&D or Pathfinder, what would you have? Likely something that felt like an overly simplified miniature skirmish game, each player only playing one model rather than a team or an army. In other words, a pretty dull experience, or at least not one you would return to week after week for years. And why do you come back to your regular campaign? To see what's going to happen, right? How the story is going to play out. Are you more likely to abstractly imagine and look forward to specific types of combat? Or are you wondering, how soon will I get to crush that villain who mocked the horrific loss of my character's betrothed? Then let's talk about so-called gamism. Somebody who supposedly does come week after week to gamify things, to figure out new ways to kill monsters even faster and all of that. What is it they're winning exactly? Sure, you can, I guess, win a combat by surviving it, but you don't really lose the campaign if your character dies. You find a way to bring them back to life, or you create a new character and you keep playing. Why? Because you didn't lose the game at all. You still get to play. And finally, simulationism, perhaps the weakest of the three in my opinion. In fact, I'm bold enough to say realism itself is not the primary goal of any successful RPG. If you really want a fully realistic combat experience, you can get that by studying and learning actual sword fighting techniques. But a game is, by definition, an abstraction. Yes, the rules should feel internally consistent and not pointlessly ridiculous. Some level of realism can help certain types of games, but the point I'm making is that simulating different realities is not the primary goal of these games. This one is a very common preconception people have for whatever reason, though. As a GM, I can't tell you how many times a player would complain about a rule saying, well, that isn't realistic. Lately, for example, in a D&D game, I'll respond with, well, it isn't realistic that you can come so close to death, even be in a brief coma, maybe have a black eye and all you need is a good night's sleep and you're back at your physical prime immediately. Even the black eye is gone. So if you want to play realistically, then we can get realistic, and a long rest will no longer heal your hit points, and also you can't fire a bow down a long corridor that is only 5 feet high. Looking at it this way, it's pretty easy to see that if we tried to apply realism to everything in the game, it'd become pretty unfun pretty fast. No, RPGs are not improvised documentaries about life in historical times or in-depth analyses of what-ifs, as in what if magic was really real and needed to take physics into account. What really matters is if rules feel balanced, fun, and that combat feels like it has some degree of risk and challenge. Now, I'm taking a strong position here about what the primary goal of an RPG is, and that's definitely collaborative storytelling, but it's also definitely true that there is fun in the tactical aspects of games that feature tactical combat, like D&D and like Pathfinder. And it's even true that a simulation of a certain feel or genre, rather than real-life physics, can greatly enhance an RPG if applied where it can enhance the feel of the game rather than slavishly bog it down. These are all great secondary goals of an RPG, but with no story, you're not really playing one. You might be playing what is sometimes called a tactical RPG, which is often a miniatures combat game that includes leveling up and gaining experience and getting loot and all of those things. But there's a reason they tend to give those games a distinctive and different name, so they won't imply they're traditional tabletop RPGs. I'm also not knocking CRPGs, MMOs, or tabletop tactical RPGs. I've played all these types of games, and I find all of them fun to one degree or another. But if what I want is to play a TTRPG, I'm looking for gameplay aspects that are bound together by one thing: characters interacting with a story and developing along with it. And that's why it's things like Critical Role and Stranger Things that have resonated so strongly with the newest generation of RPG gamers who were brought into this hobby by that kind of media. People are most drawn to the fun story aspects that happen in Critical Role, not the number crunching or character builds. The same is true of Stranger Things. You don't see a bunch of scenes of, say, Dustin gloating over his latest power build, because that isn't what bonded those characters as they played the game. In that case, too, it was how the story played out in their imaginations, and that's the best and main thing about tabletop role-playing games. Now, I'm sure some of you will disagree with some or all of what I've said here, and I think that a rousing discussion is a great thing. Just please keep it civil, respectful, and on topic in the comments, and I look forward to your thoughts on this. I'm Dave, and thanks for watching.